Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her when she was in the ER at 0200 hours, working her fourth consecutive shift, keeping her head low while residents whispered behind their tablets. They didn't know. Nobody knew. The quiet woman in the crisp scrubs moving through Seattle General's corridors with the precise efficiency of someone trained to operate in active combat zones had spent 23 years serving her country, and she wasn't about to start talking about it now. What they didn't understand was that the scars on her hands told stories that would make their Ivy League credentials look like expensive wallpaper. And on this particular Tuesday morning in late September, as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects and the antiseptic smell of the hospital cut through everything else, Captain Brooke Sullivan walked into the ER for another day of being underestimated. The hospital air was always thick, that particular combination of bleach, human suffering, and industrial coffee that could never quite be washed away. Brooke moved through the chaos at 0600 hours with the kind of economical motion that came from spending 2 tours in Ramadi, Jolin district, where every wasted movement could get you killed. Her scrubs were pressed, her shoes polished enough to reflect the harsh overhead lighting, her dark hair pulled back so tight it could have been armor. In the locker room, before the shift officially began, she'd touched the folded flag, the one from her former intelligence asset, the SEAL operator who'd been ambushed 3 years ago while she was embedded with Charlie Platoon. The flag was worn now, the creases soft from 1,000 moments just like this, her fingertips on the stars, a silent promise that she wouldn't break cover, wouldn't compromise the operation, wouldn't let anyone know that the cardiac monitor readings meant something different to her than they did to everyone else. She closed the locker door without a sound. The ER at Seattle General was controlled chaos. 24 beds, a rotating cast of residents and attendings, an endless parade of human destruction and resilience. Brooke had spent exactly 2 years embedded here as a civilian nurse, ostensibly just another RN working the night shift, making $67,000 a year, living in a 1-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, asking no questions and answering even fewer. In reality, she was monitoring the recovery of a classified asset, a Navy SEAL from Ramadi, currently in room 347, still healing from shrapnel wounds that had nearly ended his career. The Pentagon didn't advertise those kinds of operations. They didn't put them in hospital databases or staff meetings. They just quietly inserted a decorated captain with deep cover credentials and watched to make sure the asset recovered without incident. 2 years of silence. 2 years of accepting whispered disrespect. 2 years of being overlooked by people who thought they understood the hierarchy of a hospital the way they understood the hierarchy of a country club. During morning rounds at 0630, Brooke moved through the wards with a chart in one hand and a pen clipped to her pocket, a regular ballpoint, nothing special, though the ink was actually a secure military-grade pen with encrypted messaging capability. The patients barely noticed her. That was the point. She'd learned decades ago that the best operators moved like water, observed everything, said almost nothing. Dr. Stephen Pierce, the ER director, didn't notice her either until she corrected him. It happened in Trauma Bay 1 during a routine resuscitation. A 52-year-old male, massive myocardial infarction, brought in by paramedics with a core temp of 34.1. The resident was starting in fall line. Pierce was barking orders from the corner like he was running a television show instead of a human body. "Push 1 milligram epi," he commanded, his voice carrying that particular brand of arrogance that only came with an Ivy League pedigree and a title he'd inherited through seniority rather than excellence. Brooke set down her clipboard. She didn't move fast. She didn't move slow. She moved the way she'd been trained to move, as if the decision had already been made by someone else and she was simply executing it. "Dosage is wrong," she said, her voice so quiet it could have been a thought someone was having out loud. 0.3 milligrams for cardiac arrest at this core temperature. Repeat every 3 to 5 minutes. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of agreement. The heavy quiet of challenge. Pierce turned to face her, and something in his expression shifted. His jaw tightened. His eyes, cold gray, the color of concrete, narrowed. Brooke had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who understood that his authority had just been questioned by someone he'd categorized as beneath him. In the military, that expression came just before either a negotiation or an elimination. In a hospital, it was usually something in between. Dr. Sullivan is a registered nurse, Pierce said, and the way he pronounced each word made it clear he was speaking to the residents, not to Brooke. His Ivy League ring caught the fluorescent light as he gestured with one hand, a ring from Harvard, probably, or maybe Yale. The kind of ring that cost more than Brooke's monthly mortgage. Not a physician. Not a cardiologist. A nurse. So perhaps we could let the attending manage the treatment protocols. He gave the 0.5 milligram order anyway. Within 90 seconds, the patient's arrhythmia deepened. Brooke said nothing. She just watched the monitor spike in the way everyone in that room already knew it would. By the time they pushed the correct dosage, they'd wasted 2 minutes, the difference between the patient's heart restarting and the patient being dead before lunch. He made it. Barely. And Pierce never acknowledged it. Brooke moved to the next patient without a word. She didn't have the luxury of vindication. Captain Brooke Sullivan didn't get to say, "I told you so." She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to be just another nurse who kept her head down and waited for the shift to end. Except her hands told a different story. The scars ran from her wrists to her knuckles, surgical marks from a HMMWV explosion in 2009 when an IED had detonated 8 meters from her position as she was providing medical support to a joint task force in Helmand province. The burns had taken months to heal. The scars had never faded. She kept them because erasure wasn't an option and because they reminded her every single time she looked at them why she'd come to Seattle General in the first place. Some people didn't deserve second chances. Some people did. The SEAL in room 347 was the latter. Pierce was probably the former. What Pierce saw when he watched her move through the hospital was a quiet nurse with steady hands and an unsettling ability to be right about things that didn't concern her. What he didn't see was the woman who'd been through SEAL training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, and had spent 3 weeks learning how to lie under interrogation. What he didn't see was the Navy Cross citation that sat in a safety deposit box in a bank downtown, next to her discharge papers and a photograph of her with Charlie Platoon in front of a combat outpost. What he didn't see was the slight limp in her left leg that came from taking a 7.62mm round through the femur in Ramadi, an injury she'd treated herself with a tourniquet and then ignored for 8 hours while she evacuated 2 wounded SEALs through a kill zone. He saw what everyone saw, a competent nurse. And competence, in his particular worldview, was a threat. By 0700, Pierce was in his office making phone calls. Brooke could hear his voice through the thin walls, not the words, but the tone. The kind of tone that suggested he was calling people who owed him favors. She didn't stop him. There was no point. Interference would only compromise the operation. Instead, she checked on room 347. The SEAL, name withheld from the official medical records, labeled only as Patient K in the restricted files, was sleeping. His recovery was progressing on schedule. No complications. No red flags. The mission parameters were being met. In another 6 months, when the shrapnel injuries had fully healed and the psychiatric evaluations confirmed his readiness for active duty, he'd be transferred back to Naval Station Norfolk and the next phase of his career. Then Brooke could walk away from Seattle General and back to wherever the Pentagon decided to place her next. She touched her stethoscope in her pocket, the same stethoscope she'd carried through 2 tours in Ramadi, the same one that had listened to the heartbeats of dying soldiers and had somehow managed to hear the pulse of hope beneath the blood and chaos. Then she walked back to the ER, where the morning shift was just beginning and where Dr. Pierce was watching her from across the nurse's station with an expression that suggested he'd already decided something. He sat down at the computer, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested he was accessing something he'd previously authorized, something that gave him rights most people didn't have. Their eyes met across 20 feet of humming fluorescent light and beeping monitors. Brooke didn't look away. That was the first mistake Pierce made, assuming that when someone held your gaze, they were afraid. Brooke didn't look away. That was the first mistake Pierce made, assuming that when someone held your gaze, they were afraid. Grand rounds happened every Thursday at 0800 hours in the third-floor conference room. 40 residents crowded around a long oak table, tablets glowing in their laps like prayer candles. Dr. Pierce stood at the head, clinical notes in one hand, the other gesturing with the precision of a conductor who'd memorized every note. 3 days had passed since Brooke had corrected his vasopressor error. 3 days of his stare following her down corridors, of meaningful silence when she entered a room. She knew the calculation in his eyes. He was waiting for an opening. It came during the case review of a 67-year-old male admitted with acute sepsis. Standard protocol. Dr. Pierce was in the middle of his presentation, talking about hemodynamic management, sound clinical reasoning, the importance of physician-led decision-making, when he stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at her. "Nurse Sullivan," he said, his voice pitched high enough for the entire room to hear. "Would you come up here for a moment?" The room went dead silent. Brooke stood. Every movement controlled. Every step deliberate. Her scrubs were wrinkled at the hem, her name badge hung slightly crooked from the vending machine incident this morning, but her face was a mask of polished concrete. She had trained for this. Not this exact moment, nobody trains for public humiliation, but the underlying skill, remaining functional while your superior officer systematically dismantles your credibility in front of an audience. She'd done it before in Ramadi. Pierce smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "I'd like you to explain to our residents why you felt qualified to countermand my vasopressor order on the sepsis patient last night." "The patient was hypovolemic," Brooke said. Her voice was steady, each word clipped. "Pressors without adequate volume would have caused peripheral tissue necrosis." "Fascinating." Pierce turned to face the residents, his eyebrows raised in mock wonder. "And where did you complete your medical degree?" "I didn't, doctor." "No," he said, turning back to her. "You didn't. So perhaps we allow the physicians to handle the thinking. You stick to what you're trained for. Bandages. Bedpans. The simple things." His voice dropped lower, confidential, the way a hunter might speak to observers before firing. "This is a perfect example of scope creep, people. Confidence without competence is genuinely dangerous. It gets patients killed." The resident scribbled notes. One young woman in the corner, 3rd year, probably, wouldn't make eye contact. That was mercy. Brooke's stare was flat, cold, absolutely unblinking. She waited 3 full seconds. Let the silence expand. Watched Pierce's smug grin begin to falter at the edges when she refused to look away. When the discomfort became his problem instead of hers. Then she spoke. "Funny how the only mistakes that get caught around here are the ones I'm in the room to prevent." She turned and walked out. Didn't wait for his response. Didn't flinch at the sharp intake of breath from the residents. Just passed through the double doors and into the hallway where the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical drone, and kept walking until she reached the stairwell. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw was tight enough to crack stone, but her hands didn't shake. That was discipline. 2 hours later, Brooke needed coffee. The vending machine on the 4th floor dispensed something that could generously be called coffee, dark, bitter, the texture of old motor oil, but the ritual of getting it was the only moment in the day when she allowed her shoulders to drop from their locked position. For floors up, away from the ER, away from Dr. Pierce's office. She was reaching for the button when his voice came from behind her. "There's bedpan Betty." 3 people stood in the hallway. Dr. Pierce in the center. 2 attendings on either side, both surgical, both men, both wearing the particular expression of people who'd already decided the joke would be funny. Pierce spoke loud enough that a nurse 30 feet down the corridor could hear. "Tell me, Sullivan, do you actually believe you belong here? Or are you just playing nurse until something easier comes along?" The attendings laughed. It was a sharp, bright sound, like glass breaking in an empty room. Brooke didn't turn around. She stood very still, her hand still raised toward the coffee button. Then she turned. Her eyes met Pierce's, that same cold, flat stare from grand rounds. She said nothing. Not a word. Just waited as the laughter died. Waited as the silence became uncomfortable. Waited as Pierce's smile began to crack at the edges when he realized she wasn't going to defend herself or apologize or play the role he'd written for her. Then she got her coffee. The machine rumbled, hissed, dispensed a thin stream of bitter liquid into a paper cup. She turned to leave, passing within 2 feet of all 3 men, and continued down the hallway without looking back. She could feel their eyes on her spine. That was fine. That was expected. The stronger you were, the harder they looked. The vending machine coffee tasted like rust and regret, but she drank it anyway, standing in the empty stairwell on the 4th floor, watching her reflection in the darkened window of the secured med station. 2 years undercover at Seattle General. 2 years of being invisible. 2 years of watching her rank, her experience, her expertise get stripped down and repackaged as just a nurse by men like Pierce who'd memorized everything except how to actually help people. The training had taught her patience. The military had taught her how to absorb punishment without breaking. But what sustained her wasn't strength, it was the image she kept folded in her locker. The flag. The one they'd given her after Corpsman James Mitchell from her SEAL Team 3 support element had stepped on an IED in the Jolene district and didn't step off it. That flag. That was why she endured this. At 1,430 hours, Brooke was checking vitals in room 347. Her monitored asset, the Navy SEAL from Ramadi, still recovering from blast injuries sustained during Operation Phantom Strike, lay on the bed looking better than he had 3 days ago. O2 sat was holding at 96%. Pain controlled. Wound sites clean. Routine. And then it wasn't. His oxygen saturation dropped. 48 to 45 in 12 seconds. His neck veins distended like cords pulled tight. His skin went from pale to gray. Trachea deviation. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of presentation that killed people in Kandahar because there was nobody trained to recognize it. The kind that killed people in American hospitals because people like Dr. Pierce were too proud to listen when someone like Brooke tried to warn them. Brooke's hands moved. Muscle memory. No thinking. The crash cart was open before her conscious mind had even finished the diagnosis. 14-gauge needle. Alcohol swab. The 2nd and 3rd ribs, midclavicular line, the precise angle that would slip past the parietal pleura without nicking the lung. Her hands were steady as surgical laser, and there was the hiss, that beautiful, terrifying hiss of air escaping the pleural cavity, the release of pressure, the wet sound of rescue. The SEAL gasped. His O2 saturation climbed. 78, 82, 88, stable. Across the room, in the other bed, the combat medic sat up slowly. 50s, maybe. Field-worn face like sun-dried leather. Desert Storm tattoo on his right forearm. He'd been watching the whole thing. I know that technique, he whispered. His eyes were narrow. That's not standard civilian protocol. That's TCCC. Tactical Combat Casualty Care. Who the hell trained you? Brooke's hands froze for exactly half a second. She didn't look at him. I don't know what you're talking about. Lady, the medic said, swinging his legs off the bed despite the foot still taped to his wrist, I've been deploying since Desert Storm. I know a combat medic when I see one. The way you moved. The angle. The fact you didn't hesitate for 1 second. His voice dropped. You're not just a nurse. That was when Dr. Pierce entered the room. He saw the SEAL stabilized. He saw the decompression needle. His face went very still, the way a predator goes still right before it strikes. What happened here, Nurse Sullivan? Tension pneumothorax. Brooke's voice was clinical, detached, empty of anything that might be used against her later. Occurred during routine monitoring. Needle decompression performed at the 2nd intercostal space, midclavicular line. You performed a procedure without physician authorization. He was dying, doctor. Pierce examined the patient, his movements precise and careful, checking her work like he was looking for a flaw. There wasn't one. There couldn't be. Brooke's hands had been trained by people who taught at Fort Bragg, and Fort Bragg didn't make mistakes. That's not your call to make, Pierce said quietly. The combat medic's voice cut across the room like a blade. Doc, she just saved his life with a textbook battlefield intervention. You want to stand there, Anne? I don't need commentary from the peanut gallery, Pierce said, not looking away from Brooke. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and in them was something worse than anger. It was calculation. It was a man who'd already started planning 3 moves ahead. My office. Tomorrow morning, 0600 hours. We're going to discuss scope of practice violations and what happens to nurses who forget their place. He left without waiting for a response. The combat medic approached Brooke as she documented the decompression. I'm going to figure out who you are, he said. No matter how long it takes. I know soldiers when I see them. I know people who've been to the war. Brooke finally met his eyes. There was no point in lying to him. He already knew. In a few moments, Dr. Pierce would discover those same things, and he would use them not to protect her but to destroy her. Everything she'd built over 2 years at Seattle General, the careful invisibility, the strategic humility, the performance of being less than she was, would begin to crack tomorrow morning at 0600 hours. She needed maybe 6 hours. 6 hours to figure out if her cover was salvageable, or if it was time to get on a helicopter and disappear the way people in her profession sometimes had to do. Please don't, she told the medic. But even as she said it, she knew it was already too late. The 3 nurses who rotated with Brooke on the ICU wing never questioned the new schedule posted in the break room on Tuesday morning. Hospitals changed rotations constantly, staffing needs, call-outs, budget adjustments. It happened. But what Brooke noticed, standing in front of the laminated printout with a cold cup of coffee in her hand, was the precision of the choreography. Martinez and Chen, the 2 nurses who'd worked room 347 for the past 8 months, were moved to the pediatric ward and the cardiac floor respectively. Both shifts that started at 0700. Both shifts that ended at 1900. Which meant no overlap with Brooke's typical 1500 to 2300 rotation. Which meant no one who understood the Navy SEAL patient's protocol. No one who'd watched her hands move through a needle decompression with the kind of muscle memory that only came from training most people didn't talk about. The fluorescent light above the schedule flickered, once, twice, like a warning written in Morse code. She didn't say anything. She folded the schedule back against the wall and went to check her patient assignments. Room 347 wasn't listed. The next shift rotation, posted Wednesday evening, moved her to the East Wing entirely. 3 nights of patient management in a section she hadn't worked in 6 months. The assignment sheet didn't explain the reasoning. It didn't need to. She understood the language of institutional rearrangement. It was the same language they'd used in Ramadi when command wanted to separate assets without making it obvious: different patrol routes, different timing, different checkpoints. Isolation wasn't an accident. Isolation was a strategy. By Thursday morning, Brooke had made the connection between the schedule changes and the phone calls she'd overheard Dr. Pierce making from his office. His voice had that particular quality it took on when he was building something, measured, professional, absolutely without inflection. The voice of a man documenting. She'd caught fragments while passing his door: pattern of unauthorized access, scope of practice concerns, liability exposure, I have timestamps. He was constructing an architecture of complaint, each call another brick. Each call another witness to whatever narrative he was assembling. The hospital administration wouldn't question him. Dr. Pierce was Ivy League credentials and family money, the kind of pedigree that translated to institutional trust. And Brooke was a nurse. A quiet one. A nurse who kept her head down and her mouth shut and didn't argue with doctors in front of residents. A nurse who corrected dosages only when lives depended on it, and paid a price for that kind of competence every single time. She had 3 days before her next scheduled access to room 347 would have been possible. 3 days before the medication protocol for the Navy SEAL would require someone who actually understood what they were monitoring. 3 days before the subtle alteration she'd already noticed in his blood work would compound into something irreversible. Friday evening, at 18:47 hours, Brooke tried her badge on the ICU access doors. The green light didn't illuminate. The reader beeped once, a sound like disappointment, and the door stayed locked. She swiped again. Same result. She looked at the badge in her hand, the photo of a woman named Sullivan in blue scrubs, and felt something shift behind her ribs. Not fear. Fear was a luxury she'd given up in Ramadi. This was something colder. The sensation of a trap closing. The knowledge that someone was moving pieces on a board and she was no longer controlling any of them. The nurse's station was 3 doors down. Rebecca, the charge nurse, was updating charts, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. She didn't look up when Brooke approached. "My access card isn't working," Brooke said. Rebecca's fingers paused over the keyboard. She finally glanced up, and something in her expression told Brooke that Rebecca already knew exactly why the card wasn't working. Rebecca had probably received a memo. A note. Something official that explained it without explaining anything. "You're reassigned," Rebecca said quietly. "Your new rotation starts tomorrow. East Wing, nights." "For how long?" "I don't have that information." Rebecca's voice had taken on the careful tone people used when they were delivering bad news and didn't want to be blamed for the content of it. Dr. Pierce submitted the request Wednesday. Administration approved it Thursday morning. It's in the system. The SEAL patient in 347, his medication protocol. Someone else is covering it. Rebecca's eyes returned to the screen. The conversation was over. Check the schedule in the break room. Brooke stood there for 5 seconds. 10. Rebecca didn't look at her again. The other nurses at the station suddenly became very interested in their own work, a symphony of pretend productivity, the kind of coordinated avoidance that only happened when someone had already made a choice to not see what was in front of them. She walked back through the corridor. The smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, the metallic tang of genuine fear from someone's recent bad news, hung in the air like a stain. Her shift started in 10 minutes. She needed to move. The East Wing felt like purgatory. 3 hours of managing post-surgical patients, checking vitals, hanging new bags of normal saline, charting observations that no one would scrutinize because scrutiny required attention and attention required caring and caring required seeing people as something more than their insurance classifications. She moved through the work like muscle memory, hand steady, movements efficient, voice professional. The mask was perfect. It had to be. At 2,155 hours, while a patient slept off his anesthesia and the night shift nurses were in the break room, Brooke found herself in the supply closet thinking about override codes. All ICU nurses had them. Emergency access in case of patient deterioration when the main system was down. She had hers memorized from her initial onboarding. She'd never used it. She'd never needed to. But the Navy SEAL patient's blood work wasn't normal. The medication dosages she'd glimpsed in his chart before the reassignment showed calcium channel blocker concentrations that were slightly elevated, slightly wrong. The kind of wrong that accumulated slowly, that wouldn't trigger an obvious alarm, that could stretch his recovery out by weeks or months or could, in the wrong combination with the wrong additional complication, stop his heart entirely. She couldn't prove it without seeing his full file. She couldn't see his full file without access. She couldn't have access without explaining why she needed it. At 0200 hours, the hospital moved into its deepest quiet. Skeleton crew. 2 nurses on the entire ICU wing. 1 doctor in the building, asleep in the call room, not to be disturbed unless something was actively dying. Brooke used her override code on the ICU access door. Green light. The door hissed open. The hallway beyond was dark except for the glow of the nurses' station monitors and the soft light bleeding from patient rooms. The patient files were kept in the secure server room, climate-controlled, encrypted, backed up to federal servers. She had exactly 6 minutes before the logging system would flag her access as irregular. She moved with the precision that came from having done similar work in a field hospital in Al-Anbar province where 3 minutes was the difference between retrieving intel and getting caught. Fingers on the keyboard. Username. Password. The restricted files opened like a door she'd been standing in front of for days. The Navy SEAL's full blood work. Medication chart. Recovery timeline marked in red. And there it was, small variations in the diltiazem concentrations, subtle spacing changes between doses, alterations to the for-administration flow rates. Someone with access had been systematically modifying the protocol. Slowly enough that it wouldn't trigger automated alerts. Carefully enough that it looked like transcription errors rather than deliberate action. She photographed the screen with her personal phone. Once. Twice. A third time to capture the medication administration history. Her hands moved on their own, the kind of muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with survival. 45 seconds. She had 45 seconds left before the system flagged her. The overhead light in the hallway changed. She knew that change in light the way a wild animal knows the presence of a predator. It meant a door had opened. It meant someone was standing in the doorway. It meant time had just run out. Dr. Pierce stood silhouetted against the ICU corridor lights, and behind him, 2 security guards whose expressions suggested they'd been told exactly what they would find here, a nurse. Accessing restricted files. Unauthorized. Damning. Accessing patient records without authorization is a federal violation, Dr. Pierce said. His voice was quiet. Conversational. The voice of someone who'd already won. I've documented everything. The timing. The frequency. The specific files you accessed. This isn't your first breach, is it? The surveillance cameras captured you in this room at 01:47 last Tuesday. And the Tuesday before that. He'd been waiting. He'd set the trap and waited for her to walk directly into it, and all of it, the schedule changes, the isolation from her patient, the locked access cards, had been designed to force exactly this. To back her into a corner where her only option was to break protocol and then catch her doing it. I'm placing you on immediate termination pending investigation, Dr. Pierce continued. His voice remained perfectly measured. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your badge is deactivated. You are not to re-enter this facility without authorization from administration. Brooke stood. She didn't move fast. She didn't move slow. She simply stood and looked at him across the distance of 8 feet and years of degradation and a trap that had been so carefully constructed that she'd had no real choice but to spring it. The folded flag from her fallen teammate was in her locker. The photograph on her phone was the only evidence she had that something was genuinely wrong with her patient's care. And she couldn't use any of it without revealing things that would end careers, the careers of operatives still in the field, the career of a classified mission that was supposed to be over but clearly wasn't. The security guards moved to flank her. Professional. They'd done this before. You can go with me now, one of them said, or we can do this the difficult way. Brooke walked between them. Dr. Pierce stepped aside to let them pass, and as they moved down the corridor toward the exit, she heard him say softly, almost regretfully, "You did this to yourself, Nurse Sullivan. Some people just don't belong here." The night air in the parking lot was cold. November in Raleigh carried rain that fell like a judgment, and Brooke stood beside her car for a moment, just long enough to put her hand against the cold metal and feel the only thing in her life that was still reliable. The hospital loomed behind her, all lit windows and routine, everyone inside completely unaware that a Navy SEAL patient was receiving altered medications and would likely crash within 48 hours without intervention, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do about it without destroying everything she'd spent 2 years building. She got in her car and drove away from the only cover she'd had left. The hospital loomed behind her, all lit windows and routine, everyone inside completely unaware that a Navy SEAL patient was receiving altered medications and would likely crash within 48 hours without intervention. Brooke gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do about it without destroying everything she'd spent 2 years building. She drove away from Seattle General at 11:02 p.m., her hospital badge no longer clipped to her scrubs. It was somewhere in the administrative office now, logged and catalogued as evidence of her crime. The diner on Fayetteville Street was open 24 hours. It smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one remembered faces. Brooke ordered coffee from a waitress who didn't look at her, sat in a corner booth with her back to the wall, muscle memory that never went away, and waited for morning to arrive and take with it any illusion that her sacrifice had mattered. The coffee came in a white ceramic mug, steam rising from the dark liquid. She wrapped her hands around it and watched the condensation fog the window. Outside, the parking lot lights cast everything in a sickly amber glow. Rain started sometime after midnight, hammering the glass like applause at a funeral. Her locker contents were in a plastic bag on the seat beside her. She'd retrieved them at shift change, when the ER was chaos enough that no one paid attention to a terminated employee retrieving her belongings. Inside the bag, her personal stethoscope, the trauma shears her mentor had given her before the first Ramadi deployment, her nursing license, and the folded flag. The flag had been pressed into a rigid triangle at the military funeral 9 years ago. It had belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Webb, her team medic, killed during a compound breach in Fallujah. She'd carried his body through 300 meters of open ground. The flag had lived in her hospital locker ever since, hidden beneath her extra scrubs, a physical reminder of why she endured the humiliation, why she swallowed the insults, why she'd spent 2 years playing a role that made her want to scream. She pulled the flag from the bag now and set it on the table. The coffee went cold between her hands. Brooke stared at her reflection in the window, a ghost superimposed over the parking lot lights, barely visible, barely there. A woman with nothing, doing everything for people she couldn't even speak about. 2 years of silence. 2 years of biting her tongue while Dr. Pierce made his cutting remarks. 2 years of watching residents smirk behind their tablets, watching attendings laugh at her in hospital corridors, watching everyone assume she was exactly what she appeared to be, a competent nurse, good at her job, harmless. And she'd failed anyway. She didn't know if the Navy SEAL would make it through the next 48 hours. Without her monitoring, without her knowing his vitals, without her presence in his room to catch the complications Dr. Pierce's medication tampering would cause, she had no way to intervene. The mission, her entire reason for being at Seattle General, had been incinerated in an afternoon of procedural precision that she couldn't defend against without blowing her cover and destroying the network of operatives still in the field. Her phone buzzed at 2:33 a.m. A text from her 17-year-old son, Marcus. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk." She didn't respond. What would she say? That she'd been fired from her cover job? That the classified assignment she'd sacrificed 2 years of his normal childhood for had just collapsed? That she didn't know how to tell him that sometimes even heroes lose? She stared at the flag until the diner closed at 5 a.m., then she drove back to Seattle General and parked in the employee lot as the sun bled orange across the horizon. The early shift arrivals trickled in slowly. Nurses in their scrubs, respiratory techs with their equipment bags, residents looking sleep-deprived and haunted. None of them noticed her sitting in her car, loading boxes with the contents of her locker into cardboard containers. She'd taken nothing that belonged to the hospital, just her personal items, each one a small anchor to who she actually was beneath the role. Her son appeared at 7:04 a.m. like he'd been waiting in the parking lot all night. Marcus Sullivan was 17, 6 feet tall, with the same dark eyes as his mother and shoulders that were finally filling out into manhood. He carried a shadow box made of mahogany with glass covering the interior. Inside were medals on ribbon strips, arranged in careful rows with their corresponding citations printed beneath them. She'd made him promise never to show anyone. "Marcus, go home." Her voice didn't crack. That was training. Now. No. His voice cracked instead, adolescent and fierce. "I heard what happened. I called the hospital this morning and pretended to be a doctor's office looking for a reference. They said you were terminated for violating HIPAA. Mom, that's insane. You've been breaking your back at that place for 2 years. I've seen you come home at midnight with your hands shaking from holding someone's guts together while they coded, and you're telling me that. Marcus. I don't care what you said about keeping quiet. I don't care about operational security or classified assignments or whatever you call it. I heard them laugh at you. His jaw clenched, and she saw the Marine in his future already, the one she'd hoped to spare him. Dr. Pierce called you incompetent while you were standing in the break room. I Googled you when I was 15, Mom. I know what you actually did. I know who you are. Brooke reached for the shadow box. Give it to me. No. Marcus stepped back, and she let him. Some battles couldn't be won with physical superiority. They need to see this. They need to know. He turned and walked toward the ER entrance before she could physically stop him. She followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. 2 years of cover, 2 years of buried identity, 2 years of silence, all about to detonate. The automatic doors hissed open and Marcus Sullivan walked into the emergency department of Seattle General like a young man carrying something heavier than a box of medals. Morning rounds were starting. Dr. Pierce stood near the nurses' station surrounded by residents, his posture exactly what it had been every morning for 2 years, spine straight, chin elevated, wearing his competence like armor. A Navy SEAL from Ramadi sat in a wheelchair nearby, awaiting transport for a follow-up scan. He'd been recovering for 2 weeks now, his status improving steadily despite the medication interference Brooke knew was happening somewhere in his system. Marcus held the shadow box high. His 17-year-old voice carried across the ER with the clarity of someone with nothing left to lose. You want to know who my mother is? The ER went dead silent. The kind of silence that precedes avalanches. The Navy SEAL's head snapped up from his wheelchair. His eyes locked on Brooke in the doorway. When recognition flashed across his face, it was like watching a door open in the dark. His voice was a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. Reaper 6. That's Reaper 6. Dr. Pierce stepped forward, his face already reddening, his mouth opening to dismiss this interruption with the casual cruelty that had carried him through 2 years of unchallenged authority. Young man, I don't know what your mother told you, but this is a hospital, not a... A Marine colonel in dress blue stepped out from the waiting area where he'd been sitting unnoticed, visiting another patient in the ER. He moved with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to command, and every resident in the room unconsciously straightened. He walked to the shadow box with his hand extended, and Marcus passed it to him automatically, recognizing authority when he saw it. The colonel opened the box. His voice was parade ground clear, the kind of voice trained to carry across fields and through gunfire. Captain Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy. Residents' tablets clattered to the floor. Silver Star, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces while embedded with SEAL Team 3 in Ramadi, Iraq. The colonel's eyes moved across each ribbon, each citation, like he was reading names from a memorial wall. Bronze Star with Valor device. 2 Purple Hearts. Dr. Pierce's face flushed crimson, rage and disbelief warring in his expression. This is absurd. Anyone can manufacture medals. I want security to remove this young man immediately, and I'm placing a formal complaint about. The Navy SEAL wheeled himself forward with unexpected speed. He was thin from injury, still pale from blood loss, but his voice was iron. Sir, with respect, shut the hell up. He looked at Brooke across the silent ER, and something like recognition flickered through his eyes. Ramadi, 2022, compound breach in Jolan District. You carried 3 of us through 200 meters of open ground under direct fire. I was the 3rd one. You had shrapnel in your leg and you didn't stop moving until we hit the extraction point. Brooke stood motionless in the doorway, feeling the last thread of her cover unravel. A 2-star general entered through the main ER doors. His arrival was quiet, unannounced, the kind of presence that didn't require introduction. He wore his uniform like a man who'd earned every ribbon on his chest through blood and time. He walked directly to the shadow box and executed a precise military salute, not to Brooke, but to the medals themselves, the decorations arranged in ascending order of their significance. Captain Sullivan served with distinction in naval special warfare, the general said. His voice was controlled, measured, the kind that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her assigned code name was Reaper 6. Her operational record is among the highest classified in the Department of Defense. A woman in a dark suit appeared beside him, Pentagon ID badge visible on her hip. She was already dialing, already speaking into the phone in her other hand. "I have the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command on the line confirming Captain Sullivan's active status and current classified assignment." She turned the phone toward Dr. Pierce with the casual precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "He'd like to speak with you about why you terminated an active duty officer conducting a mission on American soil." Dr. Pierce's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. His face had gone from crimson to a sickly white. There's no way, she was just a nurse." The general stepped closer. "She is a nurse. And a captain. And the reason that SEAL is alive." He gestured to the wheelchair. 2 years ago in Ramadi, and 3 days ago in this hospital when you apparently restricted her access to his care. The ER wasn't silent anymore. It was filling with sound, residents backing away from Dr. Pierce, attending studying a linoleum tiles they'd never noticed before, phones ringing with calls that no one answered. Through it all, Brooke stood in the doorway with her son beside her, watching 2 years of operational cover collapse in 5 minutes. The Navy SEAL was crying, tears running down his scarred face. The colonel was reading her citations aloud for the second time, each word hanging in the air like a benediction. The general was radiating the kind of quiet fury that comes from watching one of your people get buried alive by bureaucratic machinery. And Dr. Pierce was standing in the center of the ER with his entire world exploding around him, finally understanding that he'd never been playing chess with a nurse. The parking lot was empty except for 3 cars and a teenage boy holding a shadow box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Rain hammered the asphalt, each drop sounding like a small percussion instrument in the dark. He stood at his mother's car window, face desperate and determined in equal measure, the shadow box catching the fluorescent glow from the hospital entrance 30 yards away. Inside that frame, behind protective glass, medals caught the light like little suns. A silver star. 2 purple hearts. A Navy Commendation Medal. A bronze star. The kind of decorations that don't come from pushing bedpans or checking vitals. The kind that come from standing in the worst places on earth and refusing to break. His mother sat in the driver's seat with her hands still trembling, not from fear but from the effort of restraint. 2 years of silence. 2 years of letting them call her incompetent, overreaching, a threat. 2 years of swallowing her rank and her history and her identity because a mission mattered more than vindication. But her son didn't understand restraint. He only understood that his mother had been treated like garbage by a man who didn't deserve to breathe the same air. He held up the shadow box. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Mom, they need to see these. I don't care what you said about keeping quiet." Brooke Sullivan looked at the medals through the rain-streaked windshield. She could see the silver star from here. She could see the year on the citation. She could see her son's face, which looked so much like his father's, that same unbreakable faith that the truth always wins, that good always prevails. That sometimes you have to break the rules to make people understand. She didn't argue. She didn't explain operational security or mission parameters or the 17 people she'd been protecting by maintaining her cover. She simply nodded once and got out of the car. The rain soaked through her scrubs immediately. Her shoes made wet sounds against the parking lot asphalt, squeak, 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 as she walked beside her son back through the automatic doors. The ER doors hissed open like they were taking a breath. And that's when everything changed. Dr. Pierce was standing at the nurse's station with 3 residents gathered around him like he was Moses and he'd just parted the Red Sea. He was showing them something on his tablet, his voice smooth and confident, that particular tone he used when he was reinventing reality. The entire situation was a security breach waiting to happen, he was saying. Personnel with undisclosed backgrounds, accessing classified files, operating outside their scope of practice. We're fortunate I caught it when I did. The residents nodded like trained seals. One of them, the one who'd smirked during grand rounds, actually wrote something down. They didn't see the shadow box until it was too late. They didn't see the teenage boy in a hoodie walking straight through their little circle like it wasn't even there. He walked until he was standing directly in front of Dr. Pierce, and he held up the frame with both hands. The silence came first. Then the breathing stopped. Then everyone who could read looked at the medals. The Navy SEAL from Ramadi was in bed 347, recovering from his third surgery, barely able to lift his head. But he lifted it. His eyes went wide, then wider, then impossibly wide. He stared at the medals, then at Brooke standing beside her son, and his voice came out like a whisper that somehow traveled across the entire emergency room. Reaper 6. That's Reaper 6. The name hung in the air. The residents looked at each other. Dr. Pierce's face went through several colors very quickly. Red. Purple. A shade that probably didn't have a name in any medical textbook. He stepped forward, his mouth already forming words, already preparing his defense, already repositioning his narrative. But a voice cut through his opening gambit before he could even get the first syllable out. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Silver Star, for actions under fire while embedded with SEAL Team 3 in Ramadi, Iraq. A Marine colonel, full uniform, dress blues, the kind of pressed appearance that made everyone else look wrinkled, had materialized from somewhere near the waiting room. He was reading from the citation card in the shadow box like he'd written it himself. Which, Brooke would learn later, his unit had. Additional commendations for leadership during humanitarian operations in Jolo, Philippines, 2019. Bronze Star for bravery during escort mission near Kandahar, 2018. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Commendation Medal. Meritorious Service Medal. He looked up from the card. He looked directly at Dr. Pierce. Does that sound like a nurse who's overstepping her scope of practice to you, Doctor? Dr. Pierce's voice rose. It was starting to crack at the edges, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Even if this is true, and I'm not conceding, she violated HIPAA regulations. She accessed files without authorization. I have documentation. He pulled out his phone, hand shaking now with the tremor of a man whose entire reality was collapsing in real time. Time-stamped entries. Witness statements. A paper trail that's absolutely. A woman in a Pentagon liaison suit held up her own phone. Her voice was the kind of calm that exists only in people who've backed up their argument with federal authority. We have documentation too, Doctor. Captain Sullivan was accessing files related to her active mission parameters. What we're interested in is why those files showed medication alterations that don't match the original physician orders. She stepped closer. She smelled like expensive perfume and terrible news. Someone changed the dosages on the SEAL's pain medication 3 times over the past week. Small changes. Subtle. Almost like someone was trying to delay his recovery. Dr. Pierce's face went the color of old bone. I don't know what you're talking about. A 2-star general in dress white stepped out from behind the Marines. He was the kind of old that means he'd survived decades of politics and warfare and the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from leading people into impossible situations. He moved closer to Dr. Pierce like he was approaching something that needed to be carefully disarmed. When he spoke, his voice had the texture of gravel mixed with diesel exhaust. Why would someone do that, Doctor? The combat medic from room 347, the grizzled man who'd recognized Brooke's technique 2 years ago, shuffled forward on his crutches. He was in his 60s, with the kind of scars that tell longer stories than words ever could. I saw him in the med room 2 nights ago. 200 hours. Couldn't sleep. I was walking the halls for the pain. He was at the medication cart for room 347. The medic's voice was steady. Military steady. The kind of steady that comes from testifying in situations where your words matter. I didn't think much of it at the time. Doctors access med carts. But I remember thinking it was odd. The way he was checking his phone. The way he looked around before touching anything. Dr. Pierce's voice rose to something between a shout and a plea. That's a lie. This entire thing is a setup. I want my attorney. But there wasn't time for an attorney. There wasn't time for anything except the series of events that happened next with the inexorable momentum of dominoes. The Pentagon liaison made a single phone call. 10 minutes later, 2 FBI agents in dark suits emerged from the stairwell like they'd been waiting for their cue. They presented a warrant that had Dr. Pierce's name on it, and they did what federal agents do: they confiscated his phone, his laptop, his office files, and his access badge. One agent sat down at a terminal and pulled up the hospital server. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd done this exactly 3,000 times before. "Doctor, did you access Captain Sullivan's employment file?" The words came out very small. "I'm the ER director. I have access to all personnel files." "Did you alter any information in her file?" Silence. The kind that has weight and texture. The agent turned her laptop toward the general. "Someone modified her credential verification dates. Added flagged notes about performance issues. The metadata shows the changes were made from Dr. Pierce's login for hours after the HIPAA incident." She looked up at Dr. Pierce. Her expression suggested she'd seen this particular species of criminal so many times that the novelty had worn off around 2008. "You tried to forge her records to justify termination." Dr. Pierce backed toward the wall. He looked like something that was slowly understanding it had been backed into a corner with no exit. His Ivy League diploma suddenly seemed very far away. His board certification seemed to belong to a different person entirely. She was a threat. She didn't belong here. She's not even a real nurse. She has more trauma certifications than you have board certifications, the Pentagon liaison said quietly. And you just confessed to document forgery in front of federal agents and active military personnel. That's 18 U.S.C. 922, which carries up to 20 years. But the attempted tampering with medical records to harm a federal asset? That's another statute entirely. The handcuffs were the kind that clicked with a particular finality. Click! Click! The sound carried across the emergency room like a gunshot. Dr. Pierce's wrists went into the restraints, his face dissolving into something between rage and realization. He was led past the residents who'd smirked during grand rounds. He didn't make eye contact with them. They didn't make eye contact with him. He was walked past the attendings who'd laughed at his vending machine jokes. They suddenly became very interested in their computers. He was escorted through the ER past patients and families and visitors, past the nurse's station, past the whiteboard where his schedule used to matter. And there, standing in her Seattle General scrubs soaked with rain, was the nurse he'd decided to destroy. Except she wasn't in scrubs anymore. Someone, her son, probably, or the Marine colonel, had retrieved her navy dress whites from her car. The uniform hung on her like it had been waiting 2 years for this exact moment. Like it recognized her the way her own body had forgotten to. The White House would call it a uniform. The Navy called it dress whites. But in that moment, standing under the fluorescent lights of the emergency room at Seattle General, it was simply the truth of who Brooke Sullivan had been all along. Her spine straightened without moving. Her shoulders dropped into a posture that came from muscle memory older than her career as a nurse. Her eyes met Dr. Pierce's as he was led past, and she didn't look away. She didn't smile. She simply bore witness to his understanding, the terrible, final understanding that he'd never been playing chess with a nurse. He'd been playing chess with a captain in the United States Navy, and he'd lost on move 3. Within 20 minutes, he was gone. Within 40, the FBI had discovered his attempts to fabricate evidence in 3 other personnel files. Within 6 hours, his medical license was under emergency review by the state board. By the next morning, Seattle General had issued a statement about internal security breaches and unauthorized personnel management decisions. Dr. Pierce's name appeared nowhere in that statement. He simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. 6 months later, he'd be teaching CPR at a community college in a strip mall for $14 an hour, and nobody who'd worked with him in the ER would ever speak his name again. But that was 6 months away. This moment, the moment when the Navy SEAL looked at Brooke and actually cried, the moment when the combat medic saluted her from his crutches, the moment when a 2-star general shook her hand and said, "Captain Sullivan, your service is noted," this moment belonged entirely to Brooke. And to the people who'd never forgotten who she was. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us. The ones you'll never see coming. And comment below, have you ever been completely wrong about someone you thought you knew?